Hey everybody, Jason Sheftel here, and it's been a while, but it's time to talk about Ukraine, what it means, and where we're headed. This is a really big story, and I haven't been really on it because I wanted to try and give people a broader perspective. So I'm going to try and do that now. So here is the short and the long of what's going on right now. There's a big Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's going to succeed, but any occupation of Ukraine afterwards is almost certainly going to fail. It is going to be a brutal, multi decade insurgency, the sort of thing that makes Iraq probably look pretty nice and hunky dory. So that is what's going on. And unfortunately, even though, we all kind of know that, you've kind of figured that out really early on, kind of like with the US and Afghanistan in 2002, you could tell that, hey, if we're here for 10 more years, 20 more years, it's probably not going to do all that much good. It's not going to make much of a difference. And that's where things are with Ukraine already, even though we're still in the very early stages of the invasion. That's the way things are probably going to play out. And right now, we have the Western world really lining up against Russia, and it's basically exiling Russia from the global community. And let's be honest, this is a good thing based on what Russia has done, this huge invasion. This is what you should do. But people feel really good about this right now. There's an unexpected and pretty rare sense of unity all around the world, particularly in the West. Companies are all lining up on the same page. Even Switzerland has decided it's not going to be neutral in this one. We're in a really special moment, but we got to know and we got to realize this isn't going to last. Russia is also the largest country on Earth. And a big reason why this can't last, why this unity can't last, is because Russia's resources can't be replaced. I know you're reading in the news about how everything is going to, all the oil will be gotten from somewhere else, and the coal will come from here, and the wheat from there, the fertilizers from there, and suddenly you start to realize Russia supplies so much of everything because, again, it's the largest country on Earth. You can't replace what it has. And that is what we need to focus on because the real story behind Ukraine is not what happens in Ukraine. It's not really what the course of that war because we know how it's going to play out, almost certainly. The real story is how our world is going to transform as a result of this war. And really that's what I'm going to try and talk about right now. So, the war in Ukraine might briefly unite us, but it's also going to be, and it's right now we're seeing it in motion, right now, real time. This is the domino that is going to put an end to the world that we've known for a long time. I know that sounds ominous, but let's really just try and get into it. And one thing that's interesting about history is that Russia seems to always be the pivot of a lot of things. So the US built this global system that I'm talking about that we all live in, that we've all really only known for our whole lives, for most of our whole lives. The US built this alliance and this system to fight the Soviet Union back in the day. Then, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the US put enormous effort into trying to integrate Russia into this system and in with the rest of the world because Russia on the outskirts, mad dogging the rest of the world wasn't the best option, right? That's something everybody kind of realized in the 90s, especially with all the nuclear weapons. We want to try and bring them into the global fold as much as possible. And this was one of the big international projects of the 1990s. I know people always focus on basically the looting of Russia, the oligarchs, all that kind of stuff, and that's all true. But actually getting Russia, which was the Soviet Union just years before, to be part of the world, that was a big deal. That was a very, very big deal. And the problem now is that that project has failed, right? It's over, it's done. Russia is being kicked out, and we need to actually confront what that means for everything else because that's not a small story. That is, like I said, one of the main projects of what the US wanted to do, the world we envisioned after the Cold War was over. And now the world after the Cold War is done, and we're in the world after the Cold War. And that is something that's, even the way I worded it, it's really unknown. It's kind of vague, but it is the true case. It's what's going on right now. And we have to be real about this. This project was always going to fail eventually. And all sorts of guys in sort of foreign policy, security, military type circles, they've been saying this for a long time, but it didn't quite happen until now. But let's be real. Russia is and has always been Russia. In the 1990s, it was firebombing Chechnya. In the 2000s, it was invading Georgia. In the 2010s, it took Crimea. So now, when it goes for Ukraine, why are we all acting so surprised? So completely oh my God, where did this come from? Totally out of nowhere. Is Putin mad? Is he going crazy? Is there something wrong with his brain? Why is he mad dogging the world? Right. And I'm not going to get into that right now, the motivations for this, but let's just be honest. If you were Catherine the Great, if you were Kaiser Wilhelm, if you were an Ottoman sultan, you would watch and see what Putin is doing, and it wouldn't look all that crazy. It would look kind of normal. It would kind of look like something Russia's been doing for hundreds of years. So, this is again something where the world we lived in, this post Cold War days we've all been kind of muddling through, it clouded our perceptions about what is going on and what countries are really like. Because globalization made us think the whole world was flat. The whole world was flat. You didn't even have to focus on what countries really were. You could abstract away the parts of them that you didn't like, that didn't matter to your business or didn't matter to your international travel. And then you did that until you couldn't. And that's what we're facing right now. So we've always been living in a fantasy, and we just really wanted things to work, right? It's not because we're dumb and we're not willing to confront reality. Oh, that's kind of part of it. We're also, deep down, we know what this looks like when things go back to the way they were. If this liberal world order didn't work, then the world becomes a much darker place. And we're seeing that right now. A lot of the optimism, a lot of the enthusiasm, a lot of the hope for a better future, at least the way we've been conceiving it, is really starting to fade. It's just adding something on top of COVID and everything else. Now you feel like everything is breaking down. This is the next hammer that everyone's been waiting to come down on us. This is this weird holding pattern we've been in, waiting for something even worse to happen during COVID. And of course, COVID starts to end, or is basically ending, and then, well, hopefully, but there's no other variant. And suddenly you get this, right? So that is what's going on, right? If this liberal world order doesn't work, which we really tried to make it work, now you're in a different world, and we have to unfortunately deal with the consequences of this new world, and it's not going to be pretty. So one thing everyone needs to try and do is not focus so much on this war. I know it's tough, but don't drown in the war porn. This is a social media war. We've never really seen it like this because there's so much internet. There's an information war on both sides, with Ukraine trying to show how great it's doing and how valiant it is. And there's some truth to all of that, but it's part of a massive campaign by governments, by everyone, to try and shape this war. And the truth is, like I said at the beginning, we know the basic outlines of this war. And unfortunately for Ukraine, it's not going to be a very prosperous place afterwards, even if it wins, even if the occupation is eventually, you know, defeated, or this invasion somehow stalls, something else goes wrong and Ukraine is back to being Ukraine. We got to remember when the U.S. went into Iraq and we thought we'd get rid of Saddam, like people want to get rid of Putin now, and then you'd go and there'd be something much better that would take its place. Unfortunately, it didn't. And Iraq is kind of a mess. And unfortunately for Ukraine, its ability to integrate with the rest of the world and to merge its economies with a lot of Europe and become a part of a lot of these German industrial manufacturing systems in Eastern Europe, all this stuff, all of this is going to be much, much harder in the coming years. So we have to keep that in mind. And we can't focus on just these grisly details all around us, right? It's about the downstream consequences. And what I'm trying to get people to focus on is the broader picture here, because one thing we're doing almost as a defense mechanism is we're fixating on Ukraine, because we think if we can fix this here, we can prevent the dominoes from falling. We can keep things together. But this is a fantasy. It is a sort of center left and also a center right fantasy about kind of what we can do to make this stop. But unfortunately, it's not true. And this is going to happen regardless of what happens with unfortunately, the grisly bloodbath we're probably going to see in Ukraine. So the larger and more consequential story is lurking right behind it. And we have to focus on it, even though it's tough, even though everything is pointing to that war. It's pointing to that war as a place where we can show our moral virtues, show the fact that we're connected to the broader world. I mean, whenever there's a major war going on, people get animated. There's a deep sense of human consciousness, national consciousness. Our values are all brought to light, and that's all very important. But again, there's something much bigger going on. And so let's just talk about what that is overall. And a great way to think about it is in the 1990s and 2000s, there was a term people used to talk about. They used to throw out this word, this phrase, a new world order, right? That there was a new world order coming. It was kind of a fun conspiracy theory about how a new globalized totalitarian government was taking power behind the scenes. And there's echoes of that and all sorts of things with the WTO and stuff like that. But not the funny thing, but the awkward or somehow there's something insightful about the fact that we're about to see the precise opposite of that. We are not going to see a new world order after Ukraine. Instead, we're going to see a new world disorder. There's not going to be something after this in the next coming years, right? This is Humpty Dumpty going to pieces and no one putting him back together again. So the global system was primarily built by the Americans after 1945. And this system is on its way out. And it's been on its way out for years. You can look at the election of Trump, what was going on there. You can look at the nationalist sort of revolutions of various governments in Eastern Europe. You can look at Britain leaving the EU. You can look at all sorts of problems with China, with Japan, with everywhere in the world. There have been fires simmering and there's been kindling, and now some are starting to combust. And the key thing to remember is that neither China nor Russia nor anyone else is going to build something in its place. There's been this idea that Russia, or not really Russia, but China in particular, would build a new, different, better Chinese, or to China, better Chinese world order, and China replace the US one. But that is just not going to happen. The only country, for various reasons I can get into in other videos, the only country that can build a system like we've seen is the United States. And right now, actually, you actually can't rebuild the system. There's various reasons why: the economics of it, the politics of it, they're gone. The Pax Americana from 1945 to, you could say 2020 with COVID, now 2022 if you want with Ukraine, some point there, that's come to an end. And what we're seeing against Russia, this exiling of Russia, is a really big deal. And it's probably something like what we're going to see for China in the coming years. China is no better a place than Russia in terms of how we see our values and what we think countries, how they should behave, how they should interact with other nations, how they should treat their own people. China has just as dark and in many ways a much darker story than Russia if you go far enough back. So what we're seeing in Russia right now, where there's foreign companies that are basically fleeing, being forced to flee, there's frozen assets, there's a banking system in shambles, a currency broken, hyperinflation setting in, and a government totally disconnected from reality, at least as we see reality. That's what we're going to see most likely in China. And yet another piece of the global puzzle that can't be replaced is going to be lost as a result of this, right? So one way to think about this world that we have is that in our globalized world, formerly globalized world, partially, temporarily still globalized world, Russia provides the inputs for this world and China provides a lot of the outputs. So Russia sells cheap raw materials like minerals and metals, fuels, fertilizers, and foods, stuff like that, while using very little for itself. It doesn't have a massive economy. It doesn't have really a major industrial sector outside of the resource extraction and the military. It hasn't had one since the late 1990s, the early 1990s. It just never replaced the industry that fell away with the Soviet Union. That is something that's ultimately really good for the world that is trying to develop, right? The world got the benefit of all of Russia's vast resources for bargain prices. And this is a deal countries couldn't refuse, a lot of countries. This is why Germany put itself in the position that it put itself in. It couldn't pass up the deal for cheap, unbelievably cheap energy that could fuel its entire industrial boom of the last 30 years. It just couldn't refuse it. So that was Russia's role. And China's role in a lot of ways is to integrate the raw materials and the parts and the pieces that come from all over the world, including Russia, and it creates final manufactured products. So a third of all final global manufacturing happens within China's borders. So what happens when these inputs or these outputs in the global system go offline? When the materials or the goods or both leave the world economy? That is a real question. And that is a question, I'm sorry, whatever you're hearing in the news, it is not something that, oh, you take a little oil from Iran here, oh, you take a few resources from Indonesia there. This is not something that can be rejiggered without really fundamentally reconfiguring this system. So what you'll get and what we're going to see is a new world. And it's not going to be a happy, united new world, but a more fragmented, struggling world with ruthless resource competition and widespread deprivation. And this is precisely the world the US worked to avoid seeing for so long, both during the Cold War and afterwards, when it tried to create a system where many, many more countries could prosper. And the problem is that world is just on the way out, at least the way it was currently configured. And that is something we have to accept. And ultimately, this is not all doom and gloom. I am not trying to be Mr. Doom and Gloom here. It isn't what I'm trying to say. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. But before we can talk about that, people need to hear the real lay of the land. And we've got to see beyond the present war and start preparing more for what's really coming, because that's what matters. Because there's going to be huge changes for all sorts of things after this war. And we're already seeing it before the war even started with all the inflation and other things that were kicking in. And this is just going to add more on top of it. So just like there will be no going back to the pre-COVID days of 2019, there's no winding back the clock on this one. We're going to have to learn quickly to adapt to the new world that we're about to enter. And you can't be one of these people that are trying to pine for what existed before, right? A lot of people who are hoping that Ukraine, if you take the right stand here, it can all be secured. The whole system can keep itself together. That is a fantasy, and it's a dangerous one. And it's not going to help you in the weeks, months, and years ahead. So, all right, guys, that is it for me this time. As always, hit the like button, share, subscribe. More than ever, it might be a good idea to throw on notifications. And we're in for interesting times. So I'll be back soon, but that's it for now. So I'll see you next time.